My dear children of class 12, in my previous videos, we came to know how the poet imagined the various manifestations of the stillness. And this time it was people who started wars on nature, wars about fever and wars involving fires that ultimately leave no survivors who would stop their wars and go about their daily business like talking with their brothers, nothing. The poet hinted that a certain amount of normalcy would be returned in this way. Now, in this video, let's start from here. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. And life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. So what does it mean here, children? That in this stanza the poet introduced a new idea. He wanted to clarify that the silence he had described thus for is not to be confused with total inactivity or death. So it was all about life, not death. And his idea of stillness had no connection with death. Keep it in mind. The poet said that if humans were not so adamant about keeping their lives moving, then for once they would stop and do nothing. So he said, I want no truck with death, and if we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. So while they did nothing, they would discover in the silence a better understanding of themselves and resists the urge to hurt themselves towards death and destruction. He used the first person plural, we, and ourselves. So he included himself in this as well. Then he used an analogy of the earth which can teach human beings to be still, such as when in winter it seemed as if trees and plants were dead, but actually they were merely waiting and very much alive. As he wrote in this poem, perhaps the earth can teach us. Earth is personified here, earth is compared to a teacher. Can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. So, again the poet in the concluding stanza said, now I'll count up to 12 and you keep quiet and I'll go. So in the final stanza, the poet wrapped up the poem with a farewell in which he invited the reader to be silent up to the count of 12 while he left. So he advocates total inactivity, obviously, but not in relationship with death. Life is full of activity. And here silence refers to meditation, concentration, to create something anew in future. Okay. So the poem ends with a request that now I'll count up to 12 and you keep quiet and I'll go. So it's a request to the readers to be silent up to the count of 12 when he left. Now the poem Keeping Quiet is based on the theme of universal peace and tranquility. Neruda begins a poem by urging his readers to observe a moment of silence and stillness. You all have understood, children. And he longs for a moment, sans communication and activity, where man is at complete peace with himself and his surroundings. Now this exotic moment would be a moment of universal peace and he feels humans are preoccupied with their own progress that derives from their own selfish interest and deprives them of the true pleasure of living. And they merely exist and indulge in meaningless activities, like that of the fishermen harming the whales, man gathering salt, endangers the environment and his own life. The poet thus urges people to cleanse their souls, wear clean clothes, and work peacefully in universal brotherhood. The poet, however, does not want the readers to confuse tranquility with total inactivity, which meant sluggishness and death. So he urges people to be unselfish and wants them to allow a moment of silence to interject their fast-moving, useless lives. He wants people to look upon earth as a teacher to fulfill a greater purpose of life. So in this way, Pablo Neruda brought out the significance of this beautiful poem. Thank you, children. That's the end of the poem.